Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for being here. I know this is the most hated of all the panels today. Everybody gets scared with regulation. And we're here to talk specifically about how staking regulations are shaping out in APAC. And actually, I mean, the current state of affairs is really mixed because there's a lot of lack of regulation around the space. But we're going to hear from our panel of experts about what is happening or might be happening as well in the near future. My name is Alejandro Vargas. I'm co-founder of Mooncheck, an AI platform that's advancing transparency and compliance in the crypto space. And I'm going to allow my distinguished set of panelists to introduce themselves, maybe starting with Anuradha.
Hi everyone, my name is Anuradha. I am the founder of 023 Collective, which is a boutique law firm that specializes in disruptive technologies and entertainment.
Hi there, I'm Simon Hawkins. I'm a partner at the law firm Latham and Watkins. I'm based in Hong Kong, cover APAC, financial regulations and fintech, but particularly digital assets.
Hi, my name is Chen. I'm the co-founder and general counsel for two platforms. One is InvestaX, which is Singapore licensed, and it's a tokenization SaaS platform. We do hold a capital market services license and recognized market operator license for the tokenization, issuance, trading, and custody of real-world assets. And today I'm representing Swap, which came out of a necessity due to the lack of infrastructure in the RWA token space, and that was primarily liquidity. We tokenized things, but there was no trading and volume in the real-world asset space, so we created an AMM on our DEX that's modeled after Uniswap, and it's specifically focused for RWA tokens in a legally compliant and licensed manner with licensed broker-dealers and custodians in the back end. That's
Great, thank you. And just for everybody's benefit, we're going to do this pretty casually, try to keep it light. And since, Alice, you were sort of speaking already and talking about what you've done, and we're in Singapore, I think maybe we can start with you. I know the MAS has been pretty progressive in many ways, I guess at the forefront of actually delivering regulation, Singapore in general, around the crypto space, and very recently actually staking regulations as well, and that deal with staking and also custody. Can you tell us a little bit more about what is happening in Singapore at the moment, what those regulations look like? I know that you had to kind of go through that as well. Maybe share with the room what that was like and what's up with Singapore at the moment.
Yeah, sure. I do want to make a distinction between regulated real-world asset tokens versus utility tokens, which were largely unregulated until recently. MAS came out with a Payment Services Act in 2019, which regulate utility tokens. They call them digital payment tokens. And this would cover everything from stablecoins, NFTs, non-securities tokens. And the other side of it would be the security tokens, which are regulated under existing securities framework. And our platform, InvestaX, Swap, dealing in securities products would be regulated under the Singapore framework for securities. Now, in terms of staking, MAS didn't come out with any formative legislation yet. It did come out with some consultation papers and feedback to consultation. This is how they do things here. They do get the industry very involved. They take feedback from practitioners, and then they go away and then come out with legislation that might be better tailored to what's happening on the ground. What they did, so 2022 is when they came out with this consultation paper on staking. And then I think FTX 3AC, Celsius, the whole collapse of a lot of these on-chain lenders happened, and they took, I feel like, a step back and put out more restrictive provisions on who can do staking and how they can do staking. And so what they've said is, if you are a DPT operator, you cannot facilitate staking to retail customers. You can do that for accredited investors and institutional investors, but you must have a whole set of disclosures and as well as get explicit consent. This is mandated now. So if you have a DPT license in Singapore, for example, Coinbase, any exchange, they will no longer be able to provide staking for retail customers. But that's not to say they are prohibiting retail self-staking. So I think the unintended consequence is that it's driving potentially a lot of the use case overseas. And I think I read a report somewhere, there's about 40% of Singaporeans either hold or have dealt in cryptocurrencies, and the biggest activity they do, about 55% of them, is staking. So a lot of these users are gonna go overseas.
And if I may dig a little deeper there, I mean, you said facilitating staking. Does that also include non-custodial staking, or is it only on the custodial front?
It's any type of staking. They have not made a distinction. They have not referenced any specific type of staking, liquid staking, restaking. Any of those concepts have not been mentioned. Obviously, this is a developing and very fast developing kind of space. And they, you know, obviously staking has use cases, validating transactions, and they realize the need to permit certain activities, but they also see that there are a lot of risks, and consumer protection is important. They don't think that the retail disclosure is enough to protect retail investors, and it's why they've just put a blanket ban on all types of staking.
Yeah. And I guess we're going to go from the most advanced of the countries in this respect, or one of the most, to probably the least, because they're quite behind. But Anuradha, if you can sort of elaborate on what's happening in India as well, that would be great.
Sure. If I were to provide a short answer, it would be that not much is happening. The Indian regulations are slow to catch up. We currently have a very fragmented framework, and existing laws for money laundering, taxation do apply directly to the industry. If you look at staking, since there is a sort of administration or safekeeping of assets involved, PMLA laws would apply. So you would have to comply with reporting regulations, maintenance of like transaction records, reporting suspicious transactions, that sort of thing. But our securities regulations at the moment don't directly apply to staking, because if you look at staking and if you look at custody, or if you look at liquid staking, there is ambiguity on whether it is going to be classified as a security, if investments are going to be pooled, if there's an expectation of profits. Is it going to be classified as a collective investment scheme? Traditionally, custody in India is managed under SEBI regulations for custodians. However, you can't apply these regulations to custody or to staking at the moment, because the regulations apply to securities and to specific types of assets that are gold or silver-backed instruments. But if you apply them to digital assets, there is just no scope for application. So at the moment in India, there isn't much happening. I think we discussed this offline, that there is going to be a crypto consultation paper that was meant to be released before September. It's not out yet. But they are following, I guess, the same path that Alice mentioned happened in Singapore, that they are inviting stakeholders for their consultation, for their recommendations. I'm a member of the Bharat Web3 Association, which is the apex body in India for advocacy and policy efforts in the industry. And we've been giving recommendations, however, we are yet to receive any response from the authorities.
Do you have any sort of sense of where they might go with these regulations in any way? I mean, if you had to speculate a little bit.
So if they do apply current securities regulations to the industry, there would be implications. For example, if you're looking at custody and that applies to staking mechanisms in India, they would be classified as a security. If it is, there would be disclosure requirements, very strict ones. If staking pools are classified as collective investment schemes, they need to be registered with the Securities and Exchange Board, which is a tedious process, it's a difficult process, but it is likely that those regulations, in my opinion, would become applicable, or they would need to draft at least something completely afresh. If you're looking at, say, staking platforms that are outside the country, foreign exchange laws would apply as well, right? Because for any Indian resident, if you are sort of staking your assets with a foreign platform, it is considered to be a movement of capital across borders. And any rewards or any benefits realized from that would fall under FEMA regulations as well. So it is likely that SEBI and FEMA regulations would become applicable. But in my opinion, we do need fresh regulations, because digital assets, these regulations apply to traditional securities and traditional assets, which digital assets are not. So it may not be the best thing to apply existing laws.
It sounds a little bit like India's making it extremely difficult for validators and staking service operators to actually be able to operate within the country. I guess one more jurisdiction present here. Simon comes from Hong Kong and obviously very familiar with what's going on in Hong Kong. Hong Kong, obviously another region that's positioning itself as being, or trying to position itself as a crypto hub. And I think, I would love to hear a little bit about what we're seeing on the staking front as well, because I feel like any jurisdiction that wants to become a crypto hub has to start dealing with the concept of staking and validation, since pretty much everything's proof of stake at the moment. So yeah, how are they looking at it?
Yeah, so I think people would debate in Hong Kong whether Hong Kong's trying to become a crypto hub or if it's trying to become a Web3 hub or something else. But for sure, we have quite comprehensive regulation on digital assets. The attitude of the regulator, so our securities regulator is the Securities and Futures Commission, the SFC, is pretty negative towards unbacked crypto assets. And it's become very positive towards tokenized securities and sort of pushing traditional finance concepts or products with a wrapper on them, a digital wrapper. It's very keen on building Hong Kong as that kind of base. But separately, the Hong Kong government's out in Silicon Valley and elsewhere offering wage subsidies to bring engineers to Hong Kong to work on blockchain software projects. So there's a kind of schizophrenic, approach in Hong Kong. But particularly with staking, like the other common law jurisdictions that we're talking about, we have this legal concept of a collective investment scheme. It's basically designed for investment funds. It's where you as a investor give your assets to someone else to manage, and you expect a return from those assets. And because the definition is so broad, this can pick up staking, right? If you're not in day-to-day control of your assets, they generate a return, you've received the return, someone else is managing the platform. There are some questions that the regulators are asking about, whether that, in any of its forms, custodial, non-custodial, etc., qualifies, as a regulated product. And if it does, then you're within the full range of the securities laws, which is really problematic for various reasons. What we're seeing, though, is the recognition, as Alice kind of alluded to as well, that if you're a layer one node operator, you're a technology service provider. You're a service provider, right? You're validating transactions and you get a fee for doing that, exactly like a normal kind of service construct. It gets more difficult when you're sort of pooling assets from retail customers and then generating returns for those customers where they don't necessarily fully understand their rights or obligations or risks. And what we see from the SFC is, no bespoke regulation for staking is clearly an issue that's on their radar. And their approach at the moment is really they created this, they call it the Suspicious Investment Products List. It's an online list where they basically go name and shame products or services that they think could be regulated and they think they need to warn the investing public about. And that list is now full of different kind of staking products and services. Now, interestingly, some of those people that have been named and shamed, have actually got legal advice on their products and services, and they've kind of put rebuttals up on their website saying, we've been added to this suspicious investment products list, we respect the SFC and its view, but we disagree for reasons X, Y, and Z. But for the most part, no one wants to be on that list, right? It's a big reputational red flag. But for the moment, that is kind of where we are. That's the state of play. What there is coming down the pipe is reportedly potential consultation on creating a bespoke custody regime. And as part of that custody consultation, the question of staking almost certainly will have to be solved because custody providers are going to almost certainly want to provide staking services. Currently, none of the licensed entities, like none of our crypto exchanges that are licensed by the SFC, none of them are permitted to facilitate any staking activity. So staking is banned in all the kind of regulated, all the entities that are regulated by the SFC is banned. And the future work for the SFC is figuring out, how they develop a regime that will apply consistent rules to different staking models.
So is it similar to Singapore, where you are allowed to self-stake?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And there lies the risk, right? You might be potentially pushing a lot of users to overseas unregulated platforms where you have the prospect of maybe putting some guidance out on how staking can be done.
Yeah.
Essentially creating really more risk for the retail public unintendedly. I mean, and that's the thing. If regulators actually understood the space and the fact that it has no borders and the fact that you're just interacting with this stuff anywhere in the world, they're going to realize that that's actually probably a very bad idea to protect their own citizens. So hopefully they start moving in a direction where this starts making sense. Now, I do want to poke a little bit more around this like custodial versus non-custodial debate, because I think it's something maybe where there's a little bit of misunderstanding as well from the regulators themselves as to how things operate, perhaps not understanding the technology, not understanding smart contracts very well. I guess we are seeing a lot of conversations about the definition of custody for the space as well, and what would that cover? And I want to kind of hear from maybe the different points of views as to what are you seeing in terms of regulating non-custodial exactly like custodial, which would mean basically potentially regulating the administrator of a smart contract eventually. And what are your thoughts, personal thoughts on it? Maybe let's start with Anuradha first.
Sure. I mean, in India, it is very debatable because if you look at, say, smart contracts particularly, and if I am staking my assets on a decentralized protocol and I'm using smart contracts, and there is an issue, how would the Indian regulator respond to it? Because one, smart contracts don't have legal personhood. And two, in India, custody doesn't have a legal definition, but custodial services are services that are rendered by custodians, which are entities that sort of manage and safekeep securities and assets. But a smart contract is not an entity, it's a self-executing code. And if you look at it in a decentralized protocol, then who would they take action against? So it's very different and difficult from an Indian perspective at the moment. There are no regulations that even apply to custody of digital assets. Forget like non-custodial issues. There's no mention of it. There's no murmur of it at the moment.
Yeah, I think that's becoming kind of the norm, where these things remain silent sometimes, and it's just very, very difficult to know what's going on. Alice, in Singapore, what are you seeing? I know you mentioned that there's no distinction being made, but are you seeing any sort of conversation around the topic?
My personal opinion would be that, as we progress with the education and understanding of the technology, we can maybe get to a point where we get the regulators enough comfort. And I maybe can give an example from our own experience. As a recognized market operator exchange, traditionally, you would need to have a settlement and clearing agent. Now, we were able to convince the MAS you no longer needed that because it's all done on smart contracts, right? And so I think we can get to that point. We need to just, as mentioned, really educate the regulators on what's actually happening with non-custodial staking and where there is no legal entity, as you said, and who would you actually pursue in the event. Of course, there are people behind the smart contracts, but it's really removing a lot of unnecessary intermediaries, and that's what DeFi is all about, in my opinion, where you can leave a lot of what has traditionally been done to technology. And would we trust technology, or would we trust people to do that who come in with our own biases and, bad? Why are regulations here in the first place? It's to regulate bad actors. It's not to regulate technology, which is neutral. That's how I would look at it.
Yeah, no, and I think I've always seen these things when it comes to smart contracts as something that should be perhaps regulated from an angle of IT security measures and not really the financial system, because it's just technology, and the flaws in it really are the ones that create the risk for people that are really IT issues more than anything else. Simon, what are your thoughts on it? I know you just mentioned that nothing is allowed, so obviously nothing on paper right now from Hong Kong, but what are you seeing? And perhaps also if you can contrast to what's happening in the UK as well, because I know you're familiar with it.
Yeah, sure. Talking about custody is an abstract notion in Hong Kong. I mean, for crypto players, technically you don't need any license to be a crypto custodian. Unless you're a custodian for a regulated exchange, in which case you have to basically be owned by the operator of the exchange and you have to go and get this trustee license. But what we found was that because there wasn't no category for custody to get regulated, people would just say that they were trustees and they go and get a trust company license. And in the traditional finance world, custodians are not trustees. They expressly disclaim fiduciary duties and the fact that they are not a trustee. So it's really weird, we came about this in a really weird way in Hong Kong, where you now have all these custodians who have to say they hold the assets on trust, etc., which is, it's a good thing in the sense that it creates some safety for the investors. But because we don't really have that, we don't have a sophisticated custody regime, we definitely don't have anything built on top, which is why this kind of proposed consultation on custody is going to cover staking, and that will be interesting. But I do think as well, the regulators, they don't regulate technology. If you look at the traditional finance space, we have high-frequency trading, algorithmic trading. We have all this kind of technology applied to traditional finance. It's very common. It's nothing new. Here we're talking about like a new kind of set of databases in blockchain, but technology application to finance isn't new. In that context, the regulators are fine. They don't go and regulate the guy who writes the algorithm. They don't regulate the company that builds an algorithmic trading system and it's white labeled by Bank of America or one of these institutional banks. They regulate the bank that's actually delivering that to the customer, and that's their model. That's their, the model of regulating an intermediary. They're just not equipped to regulate technology. Now, for years we've been talking about, well, what if a regulator ends up being one of the validators, a validator node, is receiving all the data, and that's kind of how we get on-chain regulation. But we're a million miles from that at the moment. in the UK, the Treasury Department of the UK has taken a really kind of thoughtful approach towards staking. It's been a big feature and it's a big priority issue for them because they recognise that a lot of retail customers are, accessing staking products, and there's a huge amount of consumer risk there because, they can lose money, and those products and services are not kind of adequately regulated. They recognise that this whole concept of calling staking, putting it into the collective investment scheme bucket as a security is completely wrong-headed way of thinking about it. Like, the rules just then don't really work. So you call it a collective investment scheme, but all the rules for offering and supervision, they just don't work in this context, right? So the Treasury said, we're going to come up with a taxonomy. We're going to look at all different types of staking models out there, custodial, non-custodial, liquid restaking, all this kind of stuff. And they're going to then create a regime which probably is going to be more like kind of financial promotion and disclosure-based regime, essentially saying, if you're going to offer these products, the people who are going to use them need to really understand what is the product, what is the risk, am I comfortable doing it? And that's kind of the bespoke route that they'll come up with to regulate these staking products and services. But I don't think the answer is going to be regulate the technology, self-hosting wallets and all that kind of stuff. I don't think that's the way.
Great, and you touched upon liquid staking and restaking, which adds an element of complexity. It's funny because it's one of these things. Some of these things are from like a blockchain standpoint. They could sound pretty simple. I think from a regulatory standpoint, you add any of these things into the mix and they become extra complex, especially when you're suddenly issuing a derivative that can be also restaked potentially. I guess I'm going to open it up to the panel as a whole, whomever wants to tackle the question, but what are you seeing in terms of that? Is this even going to be potentially realistically possible in a highly regulated environment that we're seeing kind of coming down the pipeline?
Can I start?
Go ahead.
If you look at liquid staking and restaking, the derivative token, in my opinion, there's no way that it won't be classified as a derivative under securities regulation. At least in India, a derivative is a contract that has its value linked to an underlying asset. In liquid staking, there's always a value linked to an underlying asset. If you are trading derivatives, you can only do that if you're a recognized stock exchange, right? So it's beyond me how it can be escaped. I don't know if you guys have a similar or different opinion.
Yeah, and I think also it starts to look restaking starts to look like rehypothecation, which is go back to Lehman Brothers and go back to the financial crisis. I think those types of products. This is like another area, right, where the product is so far ahead of the regulatory thinking. The regulators are just about coming to terms with the fact that you have node validators that do this thing called staking, and they're like, okay, that's okay. Like now we're like miles ahead of that, right? So we're talking about we don't have regulations for the basic stuff, right? So, but I agree. I think the more complex you get, not only do you increase kind of risk for the user potentially, but yeah, I do think that they look more like financial products.
Personally, I think it's a great innovative way to earn some passive income if you want to take the risk, right? Who wouldn't, think of it as a fixed deposit that's sitting in the bank and then you're able to earn, exactly, multiple times. But then you multiply the risk as well, right? As you said, it's similar to rehypothecation where multiple creditors have the same claim on the same asset. And so would the regulators care? Definitely. But I actually wanted to come back to one of Simon's points earlier just on custody. I find it really, interesting how the digital asset custody framework in Hong Kong has been under trust law. So I think the first step there is really Singapore is, actually now come out with the Payment Services Act, which captures all these activities, including custody. But before that, they also didn't have a framework. And it's important to really, regulate, I guess, based on the activity and understand the differences between traditional custody and digital asset custody. You're going to require different kinds of technology, different kinds of, penetration tests if you need to do those, smart contract audits, anything that is digital asset related. A traditional custodian would not have the capacity to do. So I think that's a good initial step.
Yeah, I mean, it honestly, just from this conversation alone, and obviously been being in the space, it seems like we're still in this game of the regulators just constantly trying to apply existing regulations on this completely new technology and completely new space. But it also creates a lot of risk for the operators in the space as well, because there's lack of certainty. And the reality is that you can take pretty much almost any of these crypto concepts that we're talking about, and you could find a regulation that's traditional regulation and apply it to it effectively. And so I think that seems the place where we're at is that place. But I want to kind of, we're almost at the end of this, and I want to make sure that we have some sort of like final remarks as well, in terms of what you guys would recommend to the projects and validators and the platforms that are providing staking services. Is there a path here to do things how they're done right now, or should they all be thinking about becoming regulated and doing things the right way, little by little? What do you think is the right approach here, and what should they be paying attention to down the line? And maybe we can, again, maybe go the same way, Anuradha first. And
I think at least what they can do right now, and this came up in the panel earlier as well, is have robust security measures and protocols in place. And another thing is, when you're operating in an unregulated industry, you do have to sort of adopt what are the best practices around the world. And at this point in time, given the current situation in India, it is very important to get insurance. So get insurance that will give some comfort to the investors, to the retail investors, and wait for regulations to kick in, or at least some clarity, maybe not this month, but perhaps in October.
Simon?
So I would say get advice. Get advice. Have a legal memo on the shelf that if you get questions from a regulator, you can pull it out and say, here's why we're not violating regulations, because it is possible to thread the needle. The definitions of these things we're talking about are broad, but that's sometimes beneficial as well, because you can find your way through them. So get good advice, keep that on the shelf for when you need it. Pay attention to what's going on in the market, so consultations, etc., that are coming out, if you can follow those. The one to follow is going to be this UK crypto asset consultation. This is really potentially going to be the first major jurisdiction that is tackling in a very detailed and actually pretty thoughtful way a way of regulating all the different kind of staking models we're talking about. And that easily could become a blueprint for other jurisdictions as well. And then the last thing I'd say is, we're talking a lot about risk. Look at what the real enforcement risk is. The real enforcement risk is US enforcement risk in all of this stuff. The Hong Kong regulator has its name and shame list. You don't necessarily want to be on it, but it doesn't kill your business if you're on it. And there's no, there have been so far no actual enforcement actions to try and pursue any product as a collective investment scheme, because the big reason is the regulator doesn't want to take it to court and lose. If they lose in court, then it opens the floodgates for everyone to design that model and say, we can do it because there's no, the regulator can't get us on this. So I'm not saying go and flout the rules, but I'm saying do be cognizant of what the real risks are.
The long arm of the US.
Coming from a Latham lawyer, that's very push the boundaries. He's telling you all. So kind of echoing Simon's advice, don't operate in the US. First piece of advice. We have Kraken, which was fined $30 million for their staking program, but I think the distinction was that they actually somehow participated and was able to produce higher returns for their, and instead of just providing the rewards from the protocol. So they had an involvement in the actual, yield, reward that the stakers were getting in return. And then my second piece of advice would be, hey, work with licensed platforms like IXSwap. No, I actually do want to mention, so we've actually just launched a really innovative concept, which is you stake and you get airdropped RWA tokens. It's never been done before, but it basically aligns the interests of all of the stakers with all of the benefits of the RWA projects that are being launched on our platform. We have a launch pad as well as building the ecosystem. So that, I'm not going to deny, will be a regulated activity, but we have the license to facilitate that. So those are, how we do benefit from not having to skirt the rules. That's another way to do it, is to go get all the licenses or work with licensed platforms.
Great. And by the way, a minor point, operating in the US is also like doing anything with US persons. So no matter where you are, they can still come and get you. Well, thanks again, everyone, for all your thoughts, and thanks for listening for the audience.